A few videos ago, I introduced this concept of selecting elements and then manipulating them. So we select an H1 or all image tags, and then we can change their color or animate them or make them do something when you click on them. So far, we've only covered the selecting half. In this video, we're going to introduce a few of the many ways to manipulate elements once we've selected them. So here are the four main things I want to talk about. The first one is, how do we change an element's style? How do we make it blue or make it hide, change the font size? Next up, we'll talk about adding and removing classes with JavaScript, and then changing the content of a tag. So how do I change the text inside of an H1 tag, for instance? And then lastly, changing attributes. So how do we change the source on an image tag or the href on an A tag? We're going to get started by talking about the style property. So when the DOM is constructed and an individual node is made or an object is made for every single element, there's a property called style. And the style property is a huge object, hundreds of properties, one for every single CSS property that we could set. So we can write JavaScript that will then go style an element differently. So here I'm selecting an element by its ID, highlight. So select it, save it to a variable called tag, and then manipulating it. And what I'm doing, I'm setting tag.style.color to be blue, tag.style.border equals 10 pixels solid red. It's important to note that the right side must be a string. So even though in CSS, we don't need to put quotes around blue or around 70px, this isn't CSS, this is JavaScript, so we still have to follow the regular JavaScript rules. So I have a simple web page set up that I'm going to use to demonstrate some of these properties. So this web page is super simple, just one H1, a paragraph. Inside of that paragraph, there's a strong tag, and then two images of two adorable corgi mixes. So what I'm going to do is go to the console, and I need to start by selecting something. And I'm going to change the color and the border of this H1. So I need to select it, and there's multiple ways to do that. I'm going to do document.querySelector H1. And then I'm going to show you h1.style, which is a giant object. Tons and tons of properties. So I'm going to try changing one of them, like h1.style.color, and make that yellow. And you can see it immediately changed to be yellow. Same thing with border, h1.style.border equals, let's do 5 pixel solid pink. And there we go. So of course, if we just wanted this to be yellow with a pink border from the time the page loaded, there's no reason to use JavaScript to do that. We just put it in our CSS file. We would use JavaScript if we wanted it to turn yellow and have a pink border when the user's been on the page for 5 seconds, or if we wanted it to happen when the user scrolled to a specific part of the page or when the user clicked on something. It's all about making things interactive, and we'll see how to do that shortly. One last thing about using the style property is that if you find yourself manipulating a bunch of styles on an individual element, like I'm doing here, and changing 5 different properties on this one tag, there's definitely a better way. And there's a few reasons that there's a better way. The first one is that this is not very dry code. There's a lot of repeated tag.style, tag.style. More importantly though, there's this concept called the separation of concerns. So the separation of concerns is this concept that our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript are each responsible for their own little domain, and we don't want a lot of crossover between them. So in this diagram, you can see that there's a little bit of crossover between HTML, which is the structure, and JavaScript, which is the behavior, and then CSS is presentation, and there's a little overlap with HTML and JavaScript. But remember that it used to be, before CSS came along, you had to write your styles individually in every single element, where we actually use the style attribute. In that case, our presentation, the styling, was actually woven into the structure. And with CSS, we now have separated them out. So our HTML is pure structure, and then our CSS is pure style. So where JavaScript fits in is that it should control the behavior of a page. And sometimes that means changing how things look. But rather than just changing the properties inside the JavaScript, actually doing the styling in the JavaScript, what we can do is turn them on and off inside of the CSS file. So one of the patterns that's really common is that we define a CSS class like highlight. And that highlight class will have 5 or 6 or however many different properties that we're changing. And then we can then select an element with JavaScript and give it that highlight class. So in JavaScript, with one line, we can add a class that will then change 5 different properties. Let's take a look at how this would be implemented in JavaScript. So rather than selecting a tag and then changing style.color to be blue and then style.border to be 10 pixel solid red, what we could do instead is define a class. And that class could be called anything. Usually you want it to be somewhat meaningful, so reflecting what the class is supposed to do. Is it something that's being highlighted, or is it a correct answer, a high score? For whatever reason that you're applying the class, try and come up with a good name. So this is not a good name, .SumClass. SumClass is changing the color to be blue and border 10 pixel solid red. Then all I have to do is select my tag and then tag.ClassList.add SumClass. And that will give my tag with the ID of highlight a new class called SumClass, and all of these styles will be applied. There's a few other things we can do with ClassList. So in this example, I show 3 methods. Add, which we already saw, which is how we can add a class. Remove, which takes a class name, and it removes that class name from the class list. And then ClassList.toggle, which is extremely useful. It takes a class name, and if the given element has that class already, it will then remove it. If the element doesn't have that class, then it will turn it on. So very, very useful. We'll use it all the time later on. So let me demonstrate that to you. Before I go back to my example here, I'm actually going to define a new class. So rather than making a new style sheet and using a link, I'm just going to use the style tag just for the sake of time. So I'm going to define a class here. I'm just going to call it big. And what I'm going to do is change the font size to be 100 pixels and change the color to be orange. And then lastly, let's give it a border of 5 pixel solid red. So I'll leave it at that. If I refresh my page, nothing changes, of course. But what I want to do is apply that class to something. So I'm going to make this paragraph have the big class. To do that, I need to select it. So var paragraph equals document.querySelector paragraph. Okay, and let's just start by taking a look at class list. And you can see that it's empty. There are no classes assigned to this paragraph yet. So if I want to assign one, all I need to do is say p.ClassList.add, and I want to add the class big. And there we go. So it automatically reflects the new changes from my style sheet. All I had to do is add the big class. So hopefully you can see that this is a lot easier and that we're separating the responsibilities. So all that our JavaScript does is it turns on or off a specific part of the CSS. Rather than actually manually manipulating individual properties, we're now just changing things as little as possible inside of our JavaScript. So if I want to remove it, all I need to do is do ClassList.remove big. And my favorite one, which I mentioned is super useful, is toggle. So if I hit toggle right now and I hit enter, there is no class assigned. So it will assign it the class big. Now big is already assigned, so it will remove it. So this is useful, obviously not in this case, to make this crazy orange and huge font class, but what we might do is on something like a to-do list. If we want a user to be able to click on a to-do, and that will cross it out, but they can click again, and then it will uncross out or just go back to normal, that would be done, or we could do it by toggling a class. So we could have a class called done, and I click, it's applied, I click again, it's removed. That's just one example of when you might use toggle, but it's really, really useful. The last point I'll bring up about class list is that it's technically not an array. So that means that we have to use .add in order to add a class. We can't do something like .push. So just a minor note, but it's important to know that it's not technically an array. So we covered 2 different ways of manipulating style through our JavaScript. The first one is doing it manually, one property at a time, which is, it's honestly fine if you're just doing 1 or 2 things. But if you're doing it in a batch or you're doing it to multiple elements, it's much better, more conventional, better style to use a class and just turn the class on or off.